Five poorly educated but incredibly successful people. Number 5. John D. Rockefeller, billionaire. Before becoming possibly the richest man in history, taking inflation into account, John Rockefeller was the lowly son of a dodgy con artist and high school student in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. Although he had some education, by the time he was 16, Rockefeller decided it was time to shirk school, and begin a career with the goal of earning $100,000 in his lifetime. It's pretty safe to say that he accomplished that mission and then some. Rockefeller made his mark in the oil industry, starting Standard Oil, and ultimately creating a monopoly on the entire industry. By 1902, Rockefeller was worth $200 million, and before his death he would amass a fortune of more than $1 billion. And high school was supposed to be important. Number 4. Horace Greeley, journalist and congressman. Unless you're a big fan of journalism history, there's a pretty solid chance you've never heard of Horace Greeley, except maybe a fleeting mention here or there. Born in New Hampshire in the early 19th century, Greeley would go on to become one of the most influential newspaper men in American history. He also became a congressman, and I nearly forgot to mention one of the founding members of the Republican Party. Greeley did this all without any formal education to speak of. By the age of 15, he had already left home to take an apprenticeship with a printer in Vermont. By the time he was 20 he had moved to New York City, and begun working for the New Yorker, and the New York Tribune. It was his work with the Tribune that made him famous, and he would actually go on to help found a town in Colorado that bears his name. To this day, he is thought of as one of the most influential journalists in history. Number 3. John Glenn, astronaut. During the tense space race of the 1950s and 1960s, one man emerged as the face of the American attempt to beat the Soviets into space and, ultimately, to the moon. That man was John Glenn. He became a war hero and one of the most famous astronauts in history, despite being a college dropout. Glenn attended Muskingum College, where he studied science, but when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor he dropped out in order to fight in World War II. Number 2. Steve Jobs, Apple co-founder. There have been many great thinkers of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and some of them have done incredible things without ever having finished college. Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg spring to mind. But perhaps the most influential technological mind of the past century has been Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple. Number 1. Mark Twain, author and wit. Arguably the most beloved American writer and humorist in history, Mark Twain gained fame after creating the classic characters of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. In fact, his Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is considered by many to be the great American novel. Not bad for a guy who had only a minimal formal education, and who was already in the midst of an apprenticeship at the age of 11. When Twain was 18, he worked as a printer in cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, while spending his evenings in the public libraries. That's as close to a formal education as Twain would come, as he read everything he could get his hands on before becoming, of all things, a steamboat pilot. He continued working in that capacity until the Civil War broke out, and after a brief stint in the Confederate Army, he began to travel across the country, writing all the while. Twain serves as clear proof that wit simply cannot be taught.